would you do when faced with death? What would these serial killers eat and say in their final moments before facing execution? Do they feel remorse, or is it simply cold indifference? Today, we'll explore one of the most eerie and haunting aspects of serial killers in the U.S., their final meals and last words before they face their punishment. This isn't just a story about crime. It's a deeper question about repentance and the human psyche when confronted with death. In the first part of this video, we'll delve into the lives of 25 killers who paid the ultimate price, from haunting final meals to cold, detached last words. Each story serves as a reminder that not everyone feels remorse before death arrives. Now, let's begin our journey into a dark world, where death is the final price for unforgivable crimes. If this story piques your curiosity and you want to learn more, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Crimes Unearthed 911 to ensure you don't miss the next chilling true crime tale. And make sure to share your thoughts in the comments. We're eager to hear what you think. 1. Anthony Allen Shore. On January 18, 2018, Anthony Allen Shore walked into the execution chamber at Texas State Prison, his gaze cold and unflinching. There were no pleas for forgiveness, no remorse. A cold-blooded killer who had taken the lives of at least 4 victims, all of whom met their tragic end in brutal agony. Before the lethal injection was administered, Shore muttered a brief statement. "Oh, I can feel that." Those words, void of any regret, served as a stark confirmation that he had never truly felt the pain he had inflicted on his victims. He had requested a lavish last meal, but could a meal ever awaken the conscience of such a murderer? He asked for simple yet familiar dishes: beef, mashed potatoes, and steak. A meal that would never be enough to save the soul of a man like him. Moments later, the lethal injection entered his body. His death came swiftly, with no empathy, no remorse, just the inevitable conclusion to his atrocities. 2. Bobby Joe Long. On May 23, 2019, Bobby Joe Long faced his final reality in the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. A murderer who had terrorized the entire state of Florida, Long was responsible for the deaths of at least 10 women. His victims not only lost their lives, but endured unspeakable torture and abuse at his hands. There were no final words from Long. When asked for a last statement, he simply remained silent, offering no apologies, no remorse. His life, his actions, could not be redeemed by any last words. His final meal consisted of simple dishes: grilled beef, bacon, fries, and soda. Did he feel any comfort from these last bites, or was he now a man incapable of feeling the taste of life? A few minutes later, the lethal injection was administered. No pleas for mercy. His death arrived quietly, the inevitable end for the horrors he had inflicted on so many. 3. Gary Ray Bolin. On August 22, 2019, Gary Ray Bolin stood in the execution chamber at Florida State Prison, a man who had spread death across the state, claiming at least 6 victims along the I-95 corridor. These victims, all of them, died in pain and panic, unable to escape the fate Bolin had brought upon them. When asked for his final words, Bolin remained silent. No emotions were shown, no remorse. His brutal actions couldn't be undone by mere words. His final meal was simple: 3 burgers, fries, and bacon. A meal that perhaps could have comforted a man with a conscience, but not one as cold as Bolin's. Minutes later, the lethal injection was administered. His death came swiftly, without a hint of remorse. Bolin could not redeem his life, and no one was there to mourn him in his final moments. The end was inevitable, the consequence of his crimes. 4. Nicholas Todd Sutton. On February 20, 2020, Nicholas Todd Sutton stood facing the ultimate punishment at Tennessee State Prison. A cold-blooded killer, Sutton had taken the lives of his grandmother and 2 others, and also participated in a prison murder, marking him as a criminal with no hope of redemption. Before his execution, Sutton showed no fear. When asked for his last words, he simply stated, "I'm just grateful to be a servant of God." A statement that leaves one wondering, was it sincerity or just an excuse? He requested a simple final meal: fried pork ribs, mashed potatoes, and a peach pie with vanilla ice cream. Simple comforts, but would they bring him any peace or just leave him feeling empty? After his meal, Sutton was strapped into the electric chair. Everything ended in silence. No pleas for mercy, no apology for the horrors he had caused. He paid for his deeds with his life. 5. Dustin Lee Honken. On January 17, 2020, Dustin Lee Honken entered the execution chamber at Indiana State Prison. With a cold, emotionless gaze and no fear, he was ready to face the punishment for the horrific crimes he had committed. In 1993, Honken killed 5 people, including 2 children. A drug dealer, his killings became one of the most chilling cases in American history. Yet, on this day, there was no remorse from him. When asked for his final words, Honken simply read a religious poem, Heaven, and prayed, "Hail Mary, Mother of God, pray for me." These were not words of regret, but rather a psychological preparation for his departure. As for his final meal, he requested a simple meal, but can a meal undo the horrors he committed? After the meal, the lethal injection was administered, and his life came to an end quietly, without any remorse. The death was not a release for him, but an inevitable result of his monstrous crimes. 6. Dominique Marcel Ray. On February 7, 2019, Dominique Marcel Ray entered the execution chamber at Alabama State Prison. He was the man who took the life of a 15-year-old girl, committing an act of brutality that no justification could erase. Ray showed no remorse or apology in his final moments. When asked for his last words, he remained silent. The brutal acts he had committed could not be undone with a few spoken words. As for his final meal, there were no special requests from him. Perhaps, for Ray, food was a trivial part of the end he was facing. After everything was prepared, the lethal injection was administered. Death came quickly, without a plea, without remorse. Ultimately, he paid for the savage actions he had carried out. 7. Danny Paul Bible. On June 27, 2018, Danny Paul Bible faced his final moment at Texas State Prison. A man responsible for the deaths of 4 people and the horrific rapes of many others, causing unimaginable pain to innocent lives. When asked for his final words, Bible remained silent, offering no apology, no remorse. His crimes could not be erased with a few words. He failed to grasp the profound suffering he inflicted on his victims. As for his last meal, Bible made no special requests. Perhaps, for him, food was nothing more than a fleeting comfort. Minutes later, the lethal injection was administered. His last moments passed in silence, and death arrived as an inevitable conclusion, a direct consequence of the torment he had brought upon others. 8. Ricky Gray. On January 18, 2017, Ricky Gray stood before his final reckoning at Virginia State Prison. He was the cold-blooded killer responsible for the deaths of 7 people over the course of 1 week in 2006. From his wife and children to innocent strangers, all became victims of his merciless violence. When asked for his final words, Gray said nothing. No remorse, no apologies. He stood in silence, as if nothing worth saying could change what had happened. His actions were clear, irreversible, and his silence spoke volumes. As for his final meal, there were no special requests, and no details on the food were provided. This only served to highlight the emotional void within him, a man who was beyond caring about what could satisfy him in his final moments. The lethal injection was given, and death came swiftly. There was no pleading for forgiveness, no last-minute regrets. He left the world with the same coldness that defined his life. 9. Carlton Michael Gary. On March 15, 2018, Carlton Michael Gary faced his final moments at Georgia State Prison. A man with a heart of stone, he was responsible for the brutal killings of at least 4 elderly women, his actions a chilling reminder of the cruelty that can lurk behind a seemingly ordinary face. In the execution chamber, Gary said nothing. There were no final words, no signs of fear, no sign of remorse. He remained silent, accepting death with the same detachment that defined his killings. For his last meal, Gary made no special requests. Perhaps he knew that no meal could wash away the guilt of his heinous actions. His final moments came swiftly after the lethal injection was administered. His death, much like his life, came without apologies, without redemption, just the inevitable consequence of the choices he made. 10. Jack Harold Jones Jr. On April 24, 2017, Jack Harold Jones Jr. stood before the firing squad at Florida State Prison. not out of fear or regret, but simply because he knew that the time had come to face the price for his monstrous crimes. He had taken the lives of at least 3 women, each of them subjected to unthinkable brutality before their deaths. Before his execution, Jones spoke not a word. When asked for final words, he remained silent, offering neither remorse nor acknowledgement. For his last meal, Jones requested a simple spread: fried chicken, potatoes, beef jerky, 3 candy bars, a chocolate milkshake, and fruit juice. A modest meal, unremarkable, yet symbolic of the simplicity of a life cut short by brutality. Once his final meal was completed, the lethal injection was administered. His final moments passed quickly, without a word of remorse, no plea for mercy, and no attempt at redemption. His death was a quiet conclusion to the terror he had unleashed on innocent lives. 11. Kenneth Dwayne Williams. On April 27, 2017, Kenneth Dwayne Williams faced his final punishment at the Arkansas State Penitentiary. A man who had killed not only while incarcerated but also during an escape, adding another victim to his body count, bringing the total to 4 lives taken. A life of pain and violence, now ending with the ultimate price, the death penalty. When asked for his final words, Williams expressed regret, offering apologies to the families of his victims and pleading for forgiveness. For his final meal, Williams requested a simple meal: grilled ribs, mashed potatoes, and peach cobbler with vanilla ice cream. A meal that could not change the past, yet perhaps this was his attempt to find some comfort in his final moments. After his meal, the lethal injection was administered. His final moments passed in silence, without resistance or plea. Death came gently, but the crimes he committed would never be forgotten. 12. Oscar Ray Bolin Jr. On January 7, 2016, at the Florida State Prison, Oscar Ray Bolin Jr. faced death for the murder of 3 innocent women. His crimes are unforgettable, leaving a trail of suffering and loss in his wake. Before the execution, Bolin had no final words, no sign of regret or remorse. His life had been a series of violent actions, and now death was the inevitable consequence. His final meal consisted of a ribeye steak, baked potatoes, salad, lemon pie, and a Coca-Cola. A meal to satisfy hunger, but one that could never soothe the pain of his victims or undo the damage he had caused. After finishing his meal, the lethal injection was administered, and death came quickly. There were no words of repentance, no last-minute pleas. He passed away in silence, as the inevitable conclusion to the life he led. 13. Robert Charles Ladd. On January 29, 2015, at the Texas State Penitentiary, Robert Charles Ladd faced his final punishment. A man who had stolen the life of a woman, but his victim's death was not just an act of murder, it was a cruel, senseless act, and he showed no remorse for it. As he entered the execution chamber, Ladd said nothing, no pleas, no denials. He spoke only one short sentence to his sister: "I love you, let's ride." A farewell that was not an apology but a cold, emotionless parting. It was the final word for a man whose actions had caused so much pain. His final meal request was simple: bacon and eggs. Could any meal undo the cruelty of his actions? After finishing his meal, the lethal injection was administered. The process was swift and silent, with no plea for mercy, no remorse. Death came for him, a fitting end to the life he had chosen to lead. 14. Alfredo Rolando Prieto. On October 1, 2015, at the Virginia State Penitentiary, Alfredo Rolando Prieto, a brutal killer, faced death for his murders in both Virginia and California. Despite his numerous crimes, he never showed any remorse. Prieto said nothing before the execution. He did not request a final meal, reflecting his cold indifference. There was nothing left to offer, no comfort to seek. The lethal injection was administered, and in silence, his life came to an inevitable end. He left without remorse, as though the lives he took never mattered at all. 15. Thomas Otis Knight. On January 7, 2014, Thomas Otis Knight faced the ultimate price for his brutal actions at the Florida State Prison. Knight had taken the lives of 3 individuals, including a prison guard, and his actions could not be justified. The deaths of his victims were not accidents. They were deliberate, ruthless decisions with no mercy. When asked for his final words, Knight remained silent. The crimes he committed were clear, and death was the price he had to pay. For his final meal, Knight requested sweet potato pie, coconut cake, ice cream, and pastries, an unpretentious meal, yet full of contradictions. After the meal, the lethal injection was administered, and everything ended in silence. There were no cries, no tears, no remorse. Death arrived as an inevitable consequence for a soul long lost to evil. 16. John Ruthell Henry. On June 18, 2014, at the Florida State Prison, John Ruthell Henry faced the ultimate punishment for the heinous crimes he had committed. He had taken the lives of his wife and stepdaughter, robbing the lives of those he had once been capable of loving. When asked for his final words, John Ruthell Henry spoke with sorrow. "I can't undo what I've done. I ask for your forgiveness if you can find it in your heart." His words were not true repentance, but rather a plea for forgiveness, knowing full well that nothing could undo the damage he had caused. He did not request a final meal, perhaps understanding that food could not change the past or offer peace to a soul stained by so much violence. After the lethal injection was administered, he passed away quietly. The punishment was complete, and death was the final conclusion to his tragic life. 17. Tommy Lynn Sells. On April 3, 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells stood before his final reckoning at the Texas State Prison. A cold-blooded killer, suspected of committing over 22 murders, many of which involved innocent victims unable to defend themselves. Sells had no final words. When asked, he simply uttered two short words: "No." No remorse, no apology. This was the way he chose to end his life, a life filled with unspeakable brutality. For his final meal, Sells did not request anything special. The lethal injection was given, and in silence, his life came to an end. 18. Elroy Chester. On June 12, 2013, Elroy Chester stood before his death at the Texas State Prison. He was a man who had taken the lives of 5 individuals, including several women whom he had brutally assaulted. When asked for his final words, Chester spoke a weak plea: "Don't hate me. I'm sorry for taking your loved one." These words, though uttered in his final moments, could never make up for the cruelty he had inflicted. He could not stop the violence within himself, and now, facing punishment, he was left with only weak defenses. Chester did not request a final meal. The lethal injection was administered, and death came swiftly, just as the cold indifference he had shown throughout his life. 19. John Errol Ferguson. On August 5, 2013, John Errol Ferguson was executed at the Florida State Prison. A man responsible for the deaths of at least 8 victims, individuals whose lives he destroyed without hesitation. Ferguson had no final words. A man who had caused so many deaths, yet when faced with his own, he had nothing to say. For his final meal, Ferguson requested simple but indulgent dishes: shrimp, lobster tail, barbecued ribs, roasted chicken, watermelon, strawberries, and French fries. A meal that couldn't undo the truth of the atrocities he committed. After finishing his meal, the lethal injection was administered, and his life ended without any cries for mercy, without a hint of regret. The death came swiftly and quietly, much like the inevitable conclusion of his own life's violent course. 20. Joseph Paul Franklin. On November 20, 2013, Joseph Paul Franklin faced his fate at the Missouri State Penitentiary. He was the man behind a series of senseless killings during his campaign of racial hate. His crimes were a reflection of his deeply rooted prejudice and violence. When asked for his final words, Franklin said nothing. A man who had caused so many senseless deaths showed no emotion when faced with his own. He did not request a final meal. Franklin's indifference to his own impending death reflected his disconnection from humanity. The lethal injection was given, and his life ended quietly, as he remained unmoved by the suffering he had caused. His death marked the end of a life that brought nothing but harm to others. 21. Robert Charles Gleason Jr. On January 16, 2013, Robert Charles Gleason Jr. stood at the Virginia State Penitentiary to face his final punishment. A killer who not only murdered individuals outside the prison walls, but also took the lives of 2 fellow inmates. His violent acts within the prison walls were a testament to his cruelty, and even when facing death, he showed no remorse. When asked for his last words, Gleason delivered a strange and cold response, disconnected from the gravity of the situation. "Well, I hope Percy ain't going to forget to wet the sponge. Put me on the highway to Jackson, and call my Irish buddies POG Moen. God bless." His words did not express regret. They were merely a bizarre remark, as though he failed to grasp the severity of his actions. He didn't request a final meal, perhaps because he knew nothing could ease the burden of the life he had chosen. Gleason approached death without fear, without sorrow, just in silence. The lethal injection took his life swiftly, and he passed without a single plea for forgiveness, leaving behind nothing but a sense of inevitability for his crimes. 22. David Allen Gore. On April 12, 2012, David Allen Gore was executed at the Florida State Prison. A cold-blooded killer who had committed a series of murders, taking the lives of at least 6 women. Each life he ended brought immeasurable pain and loss to the victims' families, but in the face of death, he showed no real remorse. When asked for his final words, Gore spoke simply, "I'm sorry for my actions and I hope the families of my victims can find peace." These words, while an apology, did little to soothe the pain of those he had harmed. It was clear that his apology was not from a place of genuine regret, but rather an acknowledgement of the inevitable. For his final meal, Gore requested nothing special. No favorite dishes, no comfort foods. To him, it seemed that everything had come to an end. After the lethal injection was administered, death came quietly, without a plea, without any words of forgiveness. No one mourned him, and the punishment was the inevitable consequence of the life he had led. 23. Robert Wayne Harris. A heartless executioner. On September 20th, 2012, Robert Wayne Harris faced execution at the Texas State Penitentiary. Convicted of murdering 6 innocent people, Harris showed no remorse, no hesitation. His demeanor was calm, disturbingly so, as if he had already accepted the darkness he carried. When asked for final words, he didn't address the families he devastated. Instead, he spoke lovingly to those he cared for. "I want to tell y'all know that I love you, Billy. I love you, English Hart and Eloise Dwight. Take care of Dwight. I'm going home. I'm going home. I'll be all right, don't worry. I love y'all. God bless the Texas Rangers." Texas Rangers. Not once did he acknowledge his crimes. Not once did he apologize. He declined a final meal. Perhaps he no longer cared for earthly comforts. As the lethal injection was administered, he slipped away without resistance, leaving behind a legacy of silence and brutality. A man who showed no mercy received none in return. 24. Manuel Pardo Jr. On December 11, 2012, former police officer Manuel Pardo Jr. was put to death in Florida. Convicted of murdering 9 people, Pardo once claimed he was cleansing society, believing his victims deserved to die. But the law didn't see justice, only cold-blooded murder. Before his execution, Pardo uttered just one line: "I am sorry, but I don't fear death." Not a confession. Not an apology. Just a final statement of pride and defiance. He made no request for a last meal. When the drugs began to flow, he lay still. No protest. No remorse. Just a man accepting the end he helped write with his own hands. 25. Oba Chandler. A denier until death. On November 15, 2011, Oba Chandler entered the death chamber in Florida. His crimes, the rape and murder of a mother and her 2 teenage daughters, shocked the nation. Cold, calculated, and cruel, his actions left a permanent mark on American criminal history. When asked for final words, Chandler delivered a bitter message: "You are killing a sick, innocent man today." Even in his last breath, he denied everything. He declined a final meal. As the injection was administered, he offered no apology, no sign of sorrow. His life ended as it had been lived, without accountability. 26. Frank Spisak Jr. On February 17, 2011, Frank Spisak Jr. entered the execution chamber in Ohio. A neo-Nazi killer, he was responsible for 3 racially motivated murders and 1 attempted attack. He called himself a messenger of Hitler, wore a Nazi-style mustache during trial, and read passages from Mein Kampf as if reciting scripture. But on that final day, in the cold, clinical room where life ends, he said nothing. No apology. No justification. Not even a final delusion. His last meal was simple: spaghetti with tomato sauce, a salad, a slice of chocolate cake, and coffee. A modest meal, almost too ordinary for the weight of what he had done. As the poison entered his veins, all the ideology, all the madness, dissolved. No Hitler. No purpose. Just death. 27. Thomas Warren Wisenhant. On May 27, 2010, in Alabama, Thomas Warren Wisenhant faced his final sentence. A serial killer who murdered 4 women over the course of a decade. His crimes were calculated and merciless. He showed no emotion as he entered the execution chamber. But this time, he spoke. In a low voice, he said, "I am sorry for what I've done, and for all the pain and suffering my actions have caused. Jesus is Lord. All glory to God." Was it remorse? Perhaps. A final grasp at redemption? His last meal was fried chicken leg quarters, French fries, American cheese, orange drink, coffee, and chocolate pudding. A full, almost indulgent meal, as if pretending, for a moment, he still had freedom. But when the needle touched his arm, he knew the price for his crimes had come due. 28. Franklin Dwayne Alex. On March 30th, 2010, Franklin Dwayne Alex was executed in Texas. A violent offender, he was convicted of at least 3 murders, as well as a long string of assaults, kidnappings, rapes, and robberies. Throughout his time behind bars, Alex maintained that he wasn't the monster the world made him out to be. He declined a last meal. No food. No final indulgence. Perhaps, by then, taste didn't matter anymore. But he did speak. His final words were raw and contradictory. "I am not the monster they made me out to be. I made lots of mistakes, mistakes that took your son. I messed up. I made poor choices. I'll take it to the grave. But I've got peace in my heart. Peace, maybe, but not redemption. Forgiveness, perhaps, but the wounds he left behind could never be healed." As the drugs took hold, another life ended, and a trail of loss remained in its wake. 29. John Allen Muhammad. On November 10, 2009, John Allen Muhammad, known across the United States as the DC Sniper, was executed in the state of Virginia. Alongside a teenage accomplice, he orchestrated a wave of terror known as the DC Sniper attacks, killing at least 17 innocent people. His victims were picked off from a distance, one bullet at a time, with no warning and no chance to defend themselves. For a time, the entire country lived in fear, because each passing day meant another life taken. When he finally stood before death, Muhammad said nothing. No final words. No apology. No hint of remorse. Just a chilling silence, fitting for a man who killed from the shadows. His final meal was simple: chicken, red sauce, and a slice of cake. A meal like any other. But this time, there was no tomorrow. As the needle entered his arm, the gunfire of the past fell silent. But the wounds he left behind still echo. 30. Reginald Perkins. On January 22, 2009, Reginald Perkins, a convicted serial killer, was executed in Texas. He was first sentenced to death for the murder of his stepmother, but DNA evidence later tied him to the killings of several other women, victims who never had a chance to fight back. Perkins was a repeat offender, previously imprisoned for rape and attempted murder. He was released, and he killed again. A predator in disguise, hiding behind religion. When asked for his final words, he spoke only one sentence: "I am innocent." No apology. No sign of remorse. A denial to the very end, as if refusing to admit guilt could somehow erase the past. He declined a last meal. Perhaps because he no longer cared about anything this world had to offer. As the poison coursed through his veins, silence was all that remained. But the pain he caused, endured by his victims and their families, never faded. 31. John Joseph Fortenberry. On July 14, 2009, John Joseph Fortenberry, a drifter with a long trail of death behind him, was executed in Ohio. He murdered 5 people across multiple states. Each victim had trusted him. Some had even offered him help. He repaid them with betrayal and murder. A man who weaponized kindness. Fortenberry had no final words. No apology. No explanation. He stepped into the death chamber with nothing left to say. There is no known record of his last meal, just like much of his life, unremarkable on the surface, deadly underneath. He killed, then disappeared. And his own death came the same way, quiet, emotionless. 32. Terry Lee Hankins. On June 2nd, 2009, Terry Lee Hankins faced his final reckoning in Texas. He had murdered 5 people, including his wife and their 2 children. Innocent lives stolen by the very man who was supposed to love and protect them. Few acts are more cruel than that. Hankins made no request for a last meal. But he did speak before he died. He whispered, "I am sorry for what I've done, and for all the pain and suffering my actions have caused. Jesus is Lord. All glory to God." A final apology, whether sincere or not, could never bring back the children. As the drugs flowed through his veins, his life quietly slipped away. But the scars he left behind would stay with those who survived him forever. 33. Leon David Dorsey IV. On August 12, 2008, Leon David Dorsey IV, also known as Pistol Pete, was executed in Texas. He had shot and killed 2 Blockbuster store employees and another convenience store clerk back in 1994. His killings were fast, violent, and seemingly meaningless. Maybe for money. Maybe just because he wanted to. Dorsey declined a last meal. And when he stood before death, he showed no fear and no remorse. But he did leave final words, not for his victims, but for those who knew him. "I love all y'all. I forgive all y'all. See y'all when you get there." A strange farewell, as if death were just a destination, not a consequence. He left this world without the weight of guilt. But what he left behind were broken families and wounds that never truly healed. 34. Alvin Andrew Kelly. On October 14, 2008, in the state of Texas, Alvin Andrew Kelly, a man who killed in the shadows, was executed. He was responsible for at least 4 murders, including a couple and their infant son, all slain inside a small home in what authorities described as a drug-related dispute. Kelly once confessed, then later denied his crimes, but the evidence didn't lie. These weren't impulsive acts. They were planned, calculated, and carried out with chilling coldness. He entered the execution chamber without a word. No final statement. No last meal request. His silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, dark, and suffocating, as if he couldn't bear to face what he had done. The poison entered his veins. No plea. No apology. Just a body shutting down and a string of horrifying memories left behind. 35. Danny Harold Rolling. On October 25, 2006, Danny Harold Rolling, better known as the Gainesville Ripper, met his end in the state of Florida. He terrorized college students in Gainesville by murdering 5 people in less than a week. But Rolling didn't just kill. He mutilated, staged the crime scenes, and turned them into horrific displays. One of the most brutal cases in America during the 1990s, his spree later inspired the Scream movie franchise. On the day of his execution, Rolling did not give a final statement. Instead, he sang. A soft hymn, whispered from the lips of a man who had once embodied pure evil. His final meal? Lobster tail, luxurious, and disturbingly opposite to the savagery of his crimes. In that sterile white room, his song faded, and silence took its place. A haunting, paradoxical end to a life soaked in blood. 36. Earl Richmond Jr. On May 6, 2005, Earl Richmond Jr., a former soldier turned serial killer, was executed in North Carolina. He murdered 4 people, including 2 children, in a series of crimes that stunned the community. He had once served in the military, a position of trust and honor. But behind the uniform, he hid darkness. Richmond did not request a final meal. He offered no excuses, no blame. But when asked for his last words, he said, "I'd like to extend my deepest apologies to all the victims' families and their loved ones." Not a cry for help. Not a plea for forgiveness. Just a goodbye, tinged with quiet acknowledgement. The injection began. Within minutes, it was over. A soul departed, carrying with it a weight that few could ever forgive. 37. Donald J. Beardsley. On January 19, 2005, Donald J. Beardsley, a killer with a violent record dating back to the 1960s, was executed in Missouri. He had once been granted parole, only to commit more murders, taking the lives of 2 women. He didn't kill out of passion or rage, but for power. Because he could. Beardsley declined a final meal. No meat, no wine, no dessert. Just a quiet refusal. He entered the execution chamber without a word. No apologies. No last words. A cold silence from a man who had once studied engineering, before becoming a machine of death, fueled by his hatred for the world. As the needle pierced his skin, he didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes and disappeared. 38. Michael Bruce Ross. On May 13, 2005, Michael Bruce Ross, nicknamed the Roadside Strangler, became the first person executed in Connecticut in nearly 45 years. He murdered at least 8 young women in the 1980s, most of them in their 20s, most of them simply on their way to school or work. Ross didn't kill out of vengeance. He killed for pleasure. And that's what made him even more terrifying. He offered no final words, no apology, no emotion, just silence, as if the coldness inside him had long overtaken everything else. His final meal wasn't special. He ate the standard prison tray: turkey a la king, rice, steamed vegetables, white bread, and fruit. A bland meal for a man who no longer had anything left to savor. Death came quickly, but the nightmares he created, for the families and for a nation, will linger far longer. 39. Edward Louis Legrone. On February 11, 2004, Edward Louis Legrone was executed in the state of Texas for crimes that stir nothing but revulsion. He raped a 10-year-old girl, then murdered 3 members of her family to silence them. A calculated, ruthless massacre. Among the victims were the girl's mother and sister, gunned down in cold blood during a home invasion. Legrone made no request for a final meal. Perhaps he knew that no food could ease the weight of his conscience, if he even had one left. Before he died, he spoke a single sentence: "I'm not sad today. I'm not bitter with anyone." It was a strangely calm statement, almost as if he believed he'd done nothing wrong. But the truth is, some wounds never heal. And no matter how gentle his tone, his words could never erase what he had done. 40. William Dean Wickline Jr. On March 30th, 2004, William Dean Wickline Jr., known as the Butcher, was executed in the state of Ohio. A contract killer with ties to drug trafficking networks, Wickline's victims were murdered and disposed of with clinical precision, some so thoroughly that their remains were never found. He denied all accusations, but forensic evidence brought him to justice. His last meal was meticulously selected: a medium-rare filet mignon, potato salad, 6 buttered rolls, fresh strawberry shortcake, and butter pecan ice cream. It felt less like facing death and more like celebrating an ending. His final words carried a cryptic tone: "May tomorrow see the court shaped by more wisdom and less politics." Was it a veiled critique, a final bid to sound profound? Or simply one last attempt to hold control? Either way, his time had run out, and the Butcher met the blade of justice. 41. John Michael Hooker. On March 25, 2003, John Michael Hooker, a man consumed by rage, was executed in Oklahoma. In 1988, he murdered his ex-girlfriend and her mother in a premeditated act of revenge. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment crime. It was a calculated execution. Hooker had previously served time for manslaughter and was granted a second chance. He used it to kill again. He declined a final meal. As he stepped into the execution chamber, he turned toward the witnesses and spoke only one sentence: "Y'all stay up. I'm out." A casual farewell, almost like he was leaving a bar, detached, unbothered. But behind that line were 2 lives lost forever, and a legacy of cruelty no words could undo. 42. Robert Wesley Knighton. On May 27, 2003, Robert Wesley Knighton, a man once described as explosive like dynamite, was executed in Missouri. After serving time for manslaughter, he and 2 accomplices went on a violent spree, killing 2 strangers in Oklahoma simply for refusing to hand over money. Knighton didn't kill out of necessity. He killed because he could. The courtroom was chilled by his indifference. On the day of his execution, he ordered a deceptively normal meal: pepperoni pizza, French fries, strawberry milk, and banana cream pie. But there was nothing normal about that moment. Before the injection, he said, "I'll see you again someday. God bless you." Words that sounded kind, almost human. But no amount of kindness could change the fact that two people died simply because he wanted them gone. 43. Juan Rodriguez Chavez. On April 22, 2003, Juan Rodriguez Chavez, known as the Killer for the Thrill, was executed in Texas. Alongside a teenage accomplice, he murdered 11 people in a spree that spanned just a few months. There was no motive, no logic, just pure desire to kill. Chavez declined a final meal. Maybe he knew that no food could ever fill the emptiness inside him. Before the injection, he whispered, "I am truly sorry for taking their loved ones' lives." Was it remorse? Or just a hollow phrase rehearsed in death's shadow? Either way, with 11 lives stolen, the apology came far too late. 44. Aileen Carol Wuornos. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos, infamously known as America's first modern female serial killer, was executed in Florida. She murdered 7 men, all of whom were her clients, while she worked as a prostitute along the highways. Aileen claimed she killed in self-defense, but testimony and evidence suggested otherwise. In her final hours, she refused a full meal and asked only for a cup of black coffee. No sides, no dessert, just caffeine and chaos. Her last words were surreal. "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th, like in the movie, The Big Mothership. I'll be back. I'll be back." A cryptic promise. A final broadcast from a mind forever spiraling between pain and fury. 45. Stephen Wayne Anderson. On January 29, 2002, Stephen Wayne Anderson, a contract killer and remorseless murderer, was executed in California. He once broke into the home of an 81-year-old woman, killed her in cold blood, and then casually cooked himself a meal in her kitchen while her lifeless body lay in the next room. Anderson admitted to killing at least 8 people, including fellow inmates and hired targets. With a face carved in stone and a voice devoid of emotion, even the prison guards found him unsettling. For his final meal, he chose 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, lettuce, a slice of peach pie, ice cream, and cottage cheese, a strangely simple choice for a man whose life had been anything but. He said nothing before his death. No apologies. No last-minute pleas. Just a final breath, quiet and cold, like the man himself. 46. Alton Coleman. On April 26, 2002, in the state of Ohio, Alton Coleman entered the execution chamber with a silent expression. He was one of the most dangerous and brutal serial killers in modern American history. In just over 2 months during the summer of 1984, Coleman and his girlfriend carried out a wave of crimes across 6 states, kidnapping, raping, and murdering at least 8 victims, ranging from elderly women to children. There was no clear motive, no logic, only devastation. The people he killed weren't enemies. They were just unlucky enough to cross his path. His final meal was elaborate, almost ceremonial: a medium-rare filet mignon, fried chicken, salad, candied yams, fried onions, blueberry pie, and soda. Perhaps it was his way of pretending he was still human, still normal. Before dying, he offered a final statement that left some unsure whether to be angry or confused. "I have no excuse for what I did. I am truly sorry." But those words, whether sincere or not, could never erase the horror he left behind. Minutes later, the lethal injection was administered. Death came quickly. No objections. No mourning. 47. Burt Leroy Hunter. On June 28, 2000, Burt Leroy Hunter was executed in Missouri. His crimes began with what seemed like a simple robbery, but ended with the deaths of 2 innocent people, an elderly woman and her son. There was no question of guilt. No appeal for misunderstanding. He had killed, and he had done it viciously. Hunter didn't have a troubled past. No mental illness. No excuses. He declined a final meal. And when asked if he had any last words, he offered a bitter, empty line. There is no justice. It's time for this nightmare to be over as far as I'm concerned. No apology. No mention of the victims. Only a closing statement centered on himself, and a death that brought closure to no one. 48. Daniel Hiddle. On December 6, 2000, Daniel Hiddle entered the execution chamber in Texas, the final stop on a long and twisted road that began in uniform. Once a police officer sworn to uphold the law, he betrayed everything he was trained to defend by murdering 5 people, including a fellow officer. From protector to predator, his fall from grace was steep and irreversible. The people he killed were not enemies in war, but victims of rage and personal vendetta. In his final hours, Hiddle made no request for a last meal. When asked if he had any final words, he gave a small nod and said, "That's it. I'm finished." A cold, flat goodbye. Nothing more. Just like how he passed through the lives of others, without remorse, without hesitation. 49. Daryl Keith Rich. On March 15, 2000, Daryl Keith Rich was executed in California after more than 2 decades on death row. He was a true predator, someone who raped and murdered 3 women and an 11-year-old girl back in 1978. There was no motive but cruelty. His victims, no matter who they were deceived, manipulated, and ultimately killed without hesitation. The media dubbed him the Hilltop Rapist, a name that haunted California for years. On his final night, Rich didn't request a special last meal. He simply drank tea, broth, and a bottle of Gatorade, like a man who no longer felt anything. When asked for any last words, he spoke just one: peace. One short word, echoing through the silent chamber like irony made flesh. Peace was something he never gave, and something his victims would never have again. 50. Edward Castro. On December 7, 2000, Edward Castro entered the execution chamber in Florida. He was a drifter, homeless, moving from place to place, and leaving death in his wake. He murdered 3 men in separate attacks, all of them vulnerable, all of them people who had once tried to help him. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge. Castro's crimes were a mix of opportunity, brutality, and chilling indifference. Before his execution, he requested a last meal of beef, shrimp, ice cream, and a can of cola. Simple. Ordinary. But it was the last meal of a life soaked in blood. Castro left no final words. No explanations. No apologies. Just silence. A silence that stretched until the very end, until the lethal injection ran its course. We've now gone through 50 stories, 50 lives that all ended the same way, strapped to a cold gurney, waiting for that final dose to course through their veins. Each had their own past, their own reasons, their own last words. But whether they chose to speak, to eat, or to remain in silence, the outcome was absolute. Some tried to apologize. Some denied everything until their final breath. And some didn't bother saying anything at all. But what they all left behind was pain, unanswered questions, and lessons we should never have to learn again. We don't tell these stories to shock. We don't share them to feed a passing curiosity. These are cold fragments of memory from within the justice system, reminders that crime always leaves a scar, and sometimes, not even death is enough to make things right. And if you'd like to keep walking with us through the darkest corners of true crime history, hit like and subscribe to Crimes Unearthed 911. Every follow gives us the drive to keep telling stories that the world should never forget.